Greetings. Today we are going to be talking about the birth of what we might think of as the real modern discipline of cultural anthropology. We've talked about a couple of the figures who were forerunners. We talked about Tyler, we talked about Morgan, but the discipline went through a significant set of changes in the early 20th century that led to the real modern trajectory of cultural anthropology. Prior to that, there were some major assumptions that were made about diverse peoples around the world. Even though we look at characters like Tyler and Morgan as being notable in their time for having described human difference as something that was primarily cultural instead of innate and biological, they still had a very hierarchical way of thinking about the difference in cultures. They did view European and Europe-inspired cultures as being superior to others, more advanced. And they also saw the modalities of Western science as providing a more accurate view of the world than the ways that other people understood the world around them. So we're going to talk about how that changed. I mentioned to you before in a previous lesson that there were two major schools of sociocultural anthropology throughout most of the 20th century. There was cultural anthropology in North America and social anthropology most other places. And I said that these did basically the same thing, but there were some differences. The two readings that I assigned to you for this lesson are each representative of one of these schools, respectively. Social anthropology, what was called social anthropology, originated in the UK, and it traces its genealogy to or through a major anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski. Cultural anthropology originated in the United States and traces its genealogy kind of through into Franz Boas, who we've talked about a little bit before. He was the one who came up with the four fields way of looking at anthropology. I'll talk about the readings in a bit, but first let's talk about what these different schools of anthropology did. Importantly, we should know that most of the most important anthropologists, or many of the most important anthropologists of the 20th century, were personally trained by either Malinowski or Boas. Malinowski trained E. Evans Pritchard, Hortense Powdermaker, Raymond Firth, among others. Boas trained Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Zora Neale Hurston, among others. So let's talk about Boas. He was a Jewish-German anthropologist who moved to the United States, and he did most of his work there. A lot of his ethnographic work was with indigenous peoples of North America, notably the Inuit. And during his work with them, he developed and committed to the notion of cultural relativism. What does that mean? We've talked before about how anthropologists like Morgan believed that while people were equal, cultures were not really equal. Boas made the argument that the notion of cultural evolution is basically nonsense. It does not make sense to place human beings and their cultures on a historical timeline, to say that people who live side by side in the world today, that one is living in the past and one is living in the present. No human culture is more primitive than another one. The contemporary hunter-gatherers that Morgan assigned states of like middle or upper savagery, and their cultures were described by Boas as being completely modern. It did take a little while for this idea to catch on, but when it did, it completely transformed the discipline of anthropology. And it also began the period that I've described before of anthropologists starting to kind of be at odds with some other disciplines and a lot of mainstream ideas in our society. Boas worked at Columbia University, and he definitely made some enemies when he worked there. In the early 20th century, he started to recruit women and people of diverse racial and ethnic identity as his top students. He also committed to a very overt form of what we can call anti-racism. While many other scholars were still measuring human skulls and trying to prove that white Europeans could be demonstrated to be innately biologically and psychologically superior than other races, Boas argued that not only could white Europeans not be demonstrated to be more advanced than other people, but that European culture could not be shown to be more advanced than other cultures in the world. We're not going to go very far into this, but Boas ended up with an entire coalition of people who felt that he was kind of corrupting academia. And even today, a lot of white supremacists view Boas as a historical villain, someone whose work dealt measurable blows against institutional white supremacy. So from Boas, we get the American School of Cultural Anthropology and his emphasis on cultural relativism. And that's the people that anthropologists study should be seen as valid and according to their own terms, and also not as objects to be colonized. By contrast, going back to Morgan, while Morgan cared very much about the Iroquois people that he worked with, and he believed that they were fully human and worthy of human rights, he also believed that it would be good for them to modernize, and he felt like one of the goals of anthropology was to help non-Western people be moved into modernity. But that's not what we get from Boasian cultural anthropology. So let's talk about Malinowski, and we can go ahead and talk about the Malinowski reading that I assigned you as we talk about him too. Malinowski was a Polish resident of the UK. He actually went to do his field work while World War I was breaking out. And as a Polish national, the UK was at war with Poland. It was not safe for him to live in the UK at that time. He became kind of a refugee. And this experience contributed to his body of work. Malinowski did his field work with the people of the Trobriand Islands in the Western Pacific. And I assigned you the introductory chapter of his book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And that chapter may be one of the most heavily assigned readings in Introduction to Cultural Anthropology classes all over the world. So it's kind of a rite of passage for you now you've read it. While Boas is known for going against the biases and the preconceived notions that were held by anthropologists, Malinowski is known for going against the anthropological methods that were common during his time or before him. There was something that we now call armchair anthropology. Prior to the early 20th century, a lot of anthropology was what we call armchair anthropology. To describe armchair anthropology, imagine a white man sitting in an office somewhere in the United States or in the United Kingdom, reading anecdotes and writing dense theoretical anthropological books about people that they've never actually met, never actually seen. These people would compile secondhand information. They would write letters to Christian missionaries around the world and ask them questions, and they would compile these books, all drawn from secondhand information with these big theories about humanity. That's what armchair anthropology is. Malinowski is kind of credited with dealing a major blow to armchair anthropology. He wrote a famous passage in his book where he describes, the feeling of sitting alone on the beach, watching the ship that dropped him off sail away. Basically, he goes on to say, how can you make a claim about a group of people if you can't even speak their language? Malinowski established that to do proper anthropological fieldwork, You have to go to the place. You have to learn the language of the people. You have to stay for a pretty long time. And you also need to participate in their society as much as you can. The chapter that I assigned you to read is basically Malinowski making that argument. So the emergence of social and cultural anthropology in the early 20th century signaled a major break from anthropologies of the past. Anthropologists committed to doing long-term in-person field work with our interlocutors. We did away with this practice of framing non-Western human cultures as something that is inferior to Western culture. So I didn't assign Boaz to you. Rather, I assigned something from Ruth Benedict, who was one of his top students and is also seen as a foundational figure in American cultural anthropology. Benedict established what has become known as the culture and personality approach to anthropology. In other words, Benedict offered that when anthropologists study a culture, we should view that culture as being kind of like a personality of humanity. Basically, the same way that individual humans can have a lot of different personalities, so can cultures. And just like different personalities, sometimes we can look at them as having patterns. Benedict felt that we could do the same thing with cultures. In both social and cultural anthropology, and into the mid-20th century, anthropologists did continue using the word primitive, but they no longer meant for it to imply that people existed somewhere on a time scale. As we see in the Benedict reading that I assigned you, some societies were just seen as more simple in comparison to Western civilization, but Benedict believed that the basic structures of society were the same, but they were just on a smaller scale and maybe a little bit easier to study. Through something else that I'd like to point out is that you can see with both Malinowski and Benedict something kind of like a critique of whiteness starting to show up in anthropology. They phrase it differently. Benedict, she calls out race prejudice overtly, and I think that's pretty clear. Malinowski, it's a little bit different. To understand Malinowski's situation, you have to understand, if you're not from the UK, that people are racialized a little bit differently, and especially back in his time. And Malinowski did not really see himself as being a white person in the same way that his Anglo peers were white. If you look at pictures of Malinowski, people feel like he looks very white. If you see pictures of him sitting with the Trobriand Island residents that he did field work with, some people like to joke that he looks almost laughably white sitting next to them. But we should understand that race is a very plastic notion that's seen differently through time and space. Malinowski was Polish, and he believed, and he said this, Malinowski believed that his non-Anglo identity made him more receptive to indigenous people than his British peers. He did not believe that he was as affected with, I don't think he called it this, but what we might call something like Anglo-capitalist modernity as his British peers. You can take that however you will. That's how Malinowski felt about it. There are a few more terms I'd like you to know. There are schools of anthropological thought that are dedicated to different ways of understanding human behavior. And for a lot of the 20th century, early and mid-20th century, that's what a lot of anthropologists were really trying to do. They were trying to create kind of these schematics for understanding human behavior, these big theories that would explain why people do what they do. Malinowski is associated with a school of thought called functionalism. We talked about Benedict's culture and personality approach already. Functionalism which Malinowski is associated with, posits that all aspects of human culture serve some sort of overt function, usually a biological function. Malinowski believed that a culture is like a body, and that each part, the ceremonies, the language, the religion, constitute different parts of the body, and they contribute to this whole object. In other words, if a culture has a ceremony, Malinowski believed that the ceremony served some sort of utilitarian purpose for that culture and the people, just like a body part. He did not really see ceremonies through a symbolic lens. There's another school of thought that grew out of social anthropology as well that I'd like you to know. It's called structural functionalism, and it's associated very much with another anthropologist, Radcliffe Brown. And I'm not going to make you read Radcliffe Brown. Just know that structural functionalism posits that organized human behavior serves above and beyond everything else to build social solidarity within a group. So Radcliffe Brown, who was a structural functionalist, may not see ceremonies as necessarily having a utilitarian purpose in the same way that Malinowski did. But he would say that a lot of ceremonies are important because they define a people. It helps them feel solidarity with each other. It helps them understand who they are as a people. So, for an example, if we look at something like the potlatch ceremony from the American Pacific Northwest, we've talked about the potlatch ceremony before. If you look at the potlatch, where people would go every so often and compete with each other, trying to give the most goods and resources as they possibly could, Malinowski, through a functionalist lens, would look at that and he would say that the reason that that ceremony exists is to distribute resources. Whereas Radcliffe Brown, through the lens of structural functionalism, would say that the potlatch ceremony was an opportunity for people to experience and perform their social solidarity and their social identity as a people. Ruth Benedict, through the culture and personality approach, would say that the potlatch ceremony, that it's a local expression of the people, and that it may serve unique needs of those people, and we should try to understand it through their local terms. So looking at this that way kind of brings us to the mild divide that used to exist between social anthropology and cultural anthropology. Again, this distinction is not really that meaningful anymore, but through the mid-20th century it was. A cultural anthropologist going into the field and preparing to write their ethnography may have felt like they needed to do their field work first before knowing what they were even going to write about, and what it was going to take to describe the people that they'd spent time with. On the other hand, people have suggested that you might, if you picked up 10 ethnographies that were written by social anthropologists from that period, you would see the books all having the same chapters. They would all have a chapter called religion, and a chapter called economic system, a chapter called rites of passage, a chapter called